Hello, class. These three words are very loaded words in our society, and as we'll talk about, some of them, for example, socialism and communism, they don't mean the same thing to different adults. So it's something that can be very confusing. So we're going to talk about these three terms right now. The reason we're studying this now is these are all connected to the Industrial Revolution. Capitalism starts at that time. There were many more businesses and corporations and larger businesses than had ever existed before in human history. So the economic philosophy of capitalism started in the Industrial Revolution. And communism and socialism also started at that time. They were responses against the Industrial Revolution. People that felt that the Industrial Revolution was making a class of super rich business owners and super poor everybody else. So those are different responses against the Industrial Revolution. So a little bit about capitalism. This was started, again, when the Industrial Revolution starts. Adam Smith is British. So he was living at the time period that the Industrial Revolution was starting in Britain. The basic concepts of capitalism are what you can see around us in the United States. There's private ownership of businesses and factories. The government does not own Safeway. The government does not own McDonald's. These stores and businesses make decisions about how much things should cost. And there's competition. A hamburger at McDonald's doesn't cost $20 because if it did, Burger King would sell a hamburger for $3 and we would all go to Burger King and nobody would go to McDonald's. So that level of competition does tend to be a good thing for consumers and it makes products more affordable. That's one of the things in capitalism. Communism. Communism comes in the 1800s. The most famous philosopher behind it is Karl Marx. He's not the only philosopher behind it. It argues against private ownership of property, and communists would argue that having private ownership encourages greed. Materials and goods should be shared equally is a communist belief. And communism did believe that a violent revolution would have to take place. The majority of people, the poor workers, should rise up against the rich business owners. And they used fancy words. The bourgeoisie was the fancy word for the business owners, and the proletariat was the fancy word for the workers, the farmers and workers that should rise up. So it's a revolutionary philosophy. Now, socialism. This is where it gets a little confusing. We'll get to that later. Some adults view socialism and communism as exactly the same thing. Some adults view them differently. You can see why it's a little bit confusing. Karl Marx is also the primary philosopher behind socialism. And as it states, in the 1800s, the terms socialism and communism were synonyms. They did mean exactly the same thing. In the 1900s, there have been social democracy parties in Europe that clearly are different than communism. And so those social democracy parties in the 1900s, that's what I've defined below. Wealth and income should be shared more equally, not necessarily exactly equally, but more equally. Countries such as the Scandinavian countries that are socialist countries do have higher tax rates on the highest earning people. Government should have a role in sharing the money a little bit more equally. They do not believe in a violent revolution, unlike the communists. And certainly countries that have socialism have government-run healthcare programs, retirement programs, and welfare programs. And if you're thinking, wait a minute, the United States has all three of those things, yes, we do. We'll get to that a little bit later as well. So this is confusing for a couple of reasons. I'll pick one out of the news right now. Bernie Sanders, he calls himself a democratic socialist, but that term means different things to different people. Based on my slides, it means he's like the previous slide that was on. A socialist, not a communist. But if you look on Facebook or anywhere where people get to type their opinions, you'll find people who are calling him a communist. Those are the people who view socialism and communism as exactly the same thing, as synonyms of each other. So Americans that view those two terms equally, to those people, Bernie Sanders would be a communist. Using the 1900s split from communism and socialism, you can call Bernie Sanders a democratic socialist, and that would not mean he's a communist. So anyway, that's one of the reasons this is so confusing. Different adult Americans don't have the same definition for the two terms, socialist and communist. Here's the other reason it's confusing. It's hard to give a clear example. Often the United States is used as an example of a clearly capitalist country. But on this slide are listed, just off the top of my head, a whole bunch of socialist elements that our country has. Medicare and Medicaid are free health care for old and poorer people. Social Security is a government-run retirement account. We have food stamp programs. Public education in general is a socialist idea, providing an education for everybody, not having a business run the education. So although the United States is a capitalist country, there's not a single example of a completely capitalist country in the world. All countries have some socialist elements to them. And again, there's no clear example the other way. A clear example of a communist country is China. Oops, I have a typo. The China would not be the grammatically correct. Sorry about that. But again, China right now is not a communist country. They have some of the world's largest businesses. They have multimillionaire people. They're not sharing all of the money equally in China. There clearly are richer people and poorer people in China. So they are not at all a 100% communist country. So again, that's the second reason these terms are confusing. They're confusing to students. They're confusing to adults. The third reason it's confusing is communism in general. On the left side of this slide is the philosophy of communism as talked about by Karl Marx. Workers should revolt and take over, and after that happens, we'll be so happy sharing everything equally that we won't even need a government because everybody's just going to be so blissfully happy, we'll sit around and hold hands and sing Kumbaya. But that's not ever how it's turned out. Communist revolutions as they've turned out in the Soviet Union, Mao's China, Cuba, Cambodia, the government doesn't melt away. It stays really strong. It stays very oppressive, locks a lot of people in jail, kills people who have dissent against this government. So the communist countries have always ended up with super, what do I want to say, a spread of income with rich people and poor people, which is not the way communism was supposed to turn out, with everything shared equally. So again, if you just use the word communism, well, it depends on if you're talking about the communism philosophy or communism the way it actually has turned out in every country that did it. So to wrap up, this is confusing. It's okay that it's a little confusing. And for the assignment today that you'll be asked to do, you'll have to come up with a couple of questions of things that are confusing to you. If you cannot come up with any questions that are confusing to you about this topic, you'll lose some points because it is a confusing topic, and I just want to work through it with you. All of these economic systems connect with the Industrial Revolution. None of these really existed before the Industrial Revolution because you didn't have the businesses and things of that nature that you have today. And certainly, this argument is still with us today. How much money should Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos be allowed to have? How much should they pay on taxes that can go to, roads for everybody or health care for everybody? How much money should be taken from the super wealthy to provide services for everybody? And what services should they provide? What should that look like? Americans have a very much a difference of opinion on those questions, and they are big questions for the present and the future that deal with these terms, capitalism and socialism. Thanks for your time today, and directions on your assignment will be on my scrolling calendar.